He didn't invite her to remember the past. He invited her to prove she never belonged in his future. The ballroom shimmered under crystal chandeliers, each light reflecting off polished marble floors and glasses of expensive champagne, the kind that cost more than Emily once spent on groceries in a week, and yet somehow, none of it felt as sharp as the laughter echoing near the entrance when she stepped inside, her heels soft against the floor, her dress simple, black, understated, deliberate, while across the room, Daniel Carter stood at the center of it all, one hand wrapped around a crystal flute, the other resting casually at the waist of a woman in ivory silk, his bride, radiant and glowing under the attention he so carefully curated, and when his eyes finally found Emily, there was a pause. Not shock, not yet, just recognition followed by something colder, something almost amused, as if her presence confirmed exactly what he had expected, and then, with a smile that never quite reached his eyes, he raised his glass slightly and said, just loud enough for those nearby to hear, "Well, look who decided to show up," and the circle around him shifted, curious faces turning, whispers beginning, the air tightening with anticipation, because everyone there knew who she was, or at least who she used to be, and Emily felt it, the weight of their stares pressing against her skin like a memory she had long since buried. But she didn't stop walking, didn't hesitate, not even when Daniel took a step forward, guiding attention toward her as if she were part of the evening's entertainment. "I almost didn't recognize you," he added lightly, scanning her from head to toe, lingering just a second too long on the simplicity of her dress. "Guess some things really don't change." A few quiet chuckles followed, subtle but sharp, and someone behind him murmured something about "poor thing," the words barely audible but unmistakable in tone, and still, Emily said nothing. Her fingers relaxed at her sides, her posture straight, her gaze steady, not defiant, not broken, just still, as if she existed on a different frequency from the room around her, and for a brief second, Daniel's expression flickered, confused perhaps by the absence of reaction, but he recovered quickly, turning slightly toward his bride as if to reassure himself of his position, of his victory. "This," he said, gesturing vaguely in Emily's direction, "is someone I used to know." And the dismissal hung in the air heavier than any insult, more final than any argument they had ever had, and yet Emily didn't flinch, didn't lower her eyes, didn't offer even the smallest sign that his words had landed, because somewhere between the echo of his voice and the quiet hum of the music drifting through the room, something unspoken settled into place, something that had nothing to do with him anymore, and everything to do with what he still didn't see, because as the crowd leaned in, waiting for her to respond, waiting for the moment to break her, Emily simply inhaled slowly, her gaze passing over Daniel as if he were just another stranger in a crowded room, and then, almost imperceptibly, she allowed the faintest hint of a smile to touch her lips. Not for him, not for them, but for herself, and in that silence, sharper than any comeback, the balance of the room shifted in a way no one could quite explain. Not yet. The music continued as if nothing had happened, a soft piano melody drifting through the room, but for Emily, the sound dissolved into something distant, almost irrelevant, as her eyes moved past the crowd and settled briefly on the far wall, where a large projection displayed Daniel's company logo in polished gold letters. The same logo she had once traced with her finger on a piece of paper at a kitchen table that smelled faintly of instant coffee and unpaid bills, back when the future was still something they built together instead of something he claimed alone, and for a fleeting moment, the memory returned with unsettling clarity, the dim apartment, the hum of an old refrigerator, Daniel pacing back and forth with restless energy, while she sat cross-legged on the floor, laptop open, calculating numbers that never quite balanced, because every dollar mattered back then, every decision felt like survival. And she had believed in him with a certainty that now felt almost foreign. She had taken extra shifts, skipped meals, sold the last piece of jewelry her mother gave her just to keep his idea alive, telling herself that sacrifice was temporary, that one day it would all be worth it. And when the first investor meeting failed, she was the one who stayed up all night rewriting his presentation. When the second one fell through, She was the one who smiled and told him to try again. And when the third finally showed interest, it came with a condition that Daniel never had the courage to tell anyone else, not even his closest friends, because the deal required clean ownership, no shared liabilities, no emotional attachments, and that was the moment everything shifted, though he did not say it out loud, not at first. Instead, he brought home papers folded neatly in a manila envelope, placing them on the table with forced calm, explaining that it was only temporary, that it was just a formality, that once the company stabilized, everything would go back to normal. And Emily remembered the way his voice sounded, slightly too smooth, slightly too rehearsed, but she did not question it, not because she did not see the hesitation in his eyes, but because she chose not to, because loving him meant trusting him even when the ground beneath them felt uncertain. So she signed, without asking for a lawyer, without reading every line twice, believing that what they had built together could not be undone by ink on paper, and for a while, nothing seemed different. Until the calls came less often, the late nights grew longer, the distance between them expanded in ways that could not be measured in miles, and then one evening, without warning, he told her it was over, not with anger, not even with guilt, just a quiet finality that left no space for argument, saying that he needed to focus, that relationships were distractions, that she would understand someday. And she had stood there in the doorway, the same doorway she once waited into, greet him with tired but hopeful eyes, realizing that the life she thought they shared had already been rewritten without her. And now, standing in this room filled with people celebrating the version of him that no longer included her, Emily felt none of the sharp pain that once followed that memory, only a calm awareness, like looking at a photograph of someone she used to be, because whatever he took from her back then, whatever he believed she lost, it no longer defined the person standing here tonight. And as the laughter around Daniel swelled again, unaware of the history woven quietly into the foundation of his success, Emily's gaze drifted away from the glowing logo, her expression unchanged, her silence intact, holding within it a truth that the room was not ready to understand. Someone near the bar laughed a little too loudly, and the sound cut through the air just enough to pull Emily back from the quiet distance of her thoughts, her attention returning to the present with a calm steadiness that felt unfamiliar even to herself, as if the woman standing in that room had learned how to exist without needing permission from anyone around her. And across the floor, Daniel was still speaking, his voice carrying easily as he entertained a small group, telling a story about growth and risk and success, carefully edited to remove anything that did not fit the image he had built. And for a moment, Emily watched him the way one watches a performance, detached, almost curious, noticing the way his gestures were more deliberate now, the way his laughter came a second too late, as if he had practiced being this version of himself so many times that it had become automatic, and yet something about it felt hollow in a way that no one else seemed to notice, or perhaps no one else cared to question, because the room was filled with people who benefited from believing the story he told. And then, as if remembering something unfinished, Daniel turned again, his gaze searching until it landed on her once more, and this time he did not hide the intention behind it, stepping closer with a confidence that had once been attractive, now reduced to something predictable, something she could see through before he even spoke. "You look the same," he said, the pause in the middle carefully placed, his tone light but edged with something sharper underneath, and a few people nearby shifted subtly, sensing that this was no longer casual conversation but something more pointed, something designed, and Emily met his eyes without hesitation, not challenging him, not yielding either, simply present, and the silence stretched just long enough to make him uncomfortable, though he masked it quickly with a small smile. "I mean that in a good way," he added, as if correcting himself, though the damage was already done. Or, at least it would have been, once, and someone behind him whispered again, softer this time but still audible, "I heard she did not get anything after the divorce," followed by a faint murmur of agreement, speculation passing between strangers who felt entitled to pieces of her past, and still Emily did not respond, because there was nothing left in her that needed to defend what they thought they knew, her gaze drifting briefly past Daniel's shoulder, not in avoidance, but in quiet dismissal, as though the conversation had already ended for her. before it truly began, and that was when it happened, subtle enough that most people would miss it, but undeniable to anyone paying attention. Daniel's expression tightened for just a fraction of a second, a flicker of something unsettled crossing his face, because the reaction he expected never came. The discomfort he intended to provoke found no place to land, and instead of shrinking, instead of explaining herself, Emily simply stood there, composed in a way that made the room feel slightly off balance, as if the script had been altered without warning, and for the first time that evening, Daniel hesitated, not visibly, not enough for others to question him, but enough for the rhythm of his confidence to falter, and Emily saw it, not with satisfaction, not with triumph, but with a quiet clarity that settled deeper than any emotion, because whatever power he once held over her had dissolved somewhere along the path she had walked alone, and now, as the music shifted and the lights shimmered overhead, she realized that the most unsettling thing she could offer him was not anger, not resentment, but the simple truth that she no longer needed anything from him at all, and in that absence, heavier than any confrontation, the distance between who she had been and who she had become widened silently, leaving him standing on the other side of something he could not reach, no matter how loudly the room tried to pretend everything was still the same. The silence between them did not break with words. It dissolved instead into the quiet rhythm of the evening, the clinking of glasses, the low hum of conversation slowly reclaiming the space that had briefly tightened around them, and Emily turned away first, not abruptly, not as an escape, but as if she had already given that moment more attention than it deserved, her steps measured, unhurried, carrying her toward the far side of the room where the lights softened and the crowd thinned, and, with each step, the weight of the past seemed to fall further behind her, not erased, not forgotten, but no longer something that could reach her, and as she moved, the faint scent of fresh linen and polished wood replaced the heavy sweetness of champagne in the air, grounding her in the present, in a life she had rebuilt piece by piece without anyone watching, without applause, without validation, and the memory came back not as pain, but as contrast, the early mornings when the city was still, quiet, when the sky held that pale blue just before sunrise, when she would unlock the door to the small cafe on the corner, the bell above it chiming softly as she stepped inside, tying her apron with practiced hands, the fabric worn but clean, the routine simple but steady, and there was something honest about that life, something real in the way the coffee beans smelled as they were ground fresh each morning, in the warmth of the cup between her hands as she took the first sip before customers arrived, in the familiar faces that came in day after day, not caring who she used to be, not asking what she had lost, only seeing who she was in that moment, someone dependable, someone present, someone whole in a way she had not been before, and it was there, in that quiet rhythm, that she began to understand something Daniel never could, that value was not something given by status or stripped away by loss. It was something built, quietly, consistently, in the way she chose to stand back up when no one was there to see it, and over time, the small things added up, the extra hours, the careful saving, the late nights spent learning what she had once ignored, financial terms that used to sound distant now becoming tools she could hold, investments that started small but grew with patience, decisions made not out of fear, but out of clarity, and she did not rush, did not chase anything because for the first time in her life, she was not trying to prove something to someone else. She was simply building something that belonged to her, and somewhere along that path, without announcement, without intention, she changed, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that made it impossible for her to return to who she had been. And as Emily reached the quieter corner of the ballroom, her reflection caught briefly in the tall glass window overlooking the city lights, she paused just for a second, not to admire, not to question, but to recognize. The woman looking back at her was not defined by what she had lost, but by what she had chosen to become, and behind her, the laughter continued, the celebration carried on, Daniel's voice blending into the background once more, but it no longer held any meaning, no longer carried any weight, because the life he represented was no longer the life she measured herself against. And as she exhaled slowly, her gaze steady, her posture calm, there was a quiet certainty in the way she stood, a stillness that did not need to be announced, because everything she had become existed beyond the reach of that room, beyond the reach of him, waiting just outside the moment, ready to reveal itself when the time was right. The glass window reflected the city in soft fragments of light, but Emily's attention shifted not to the skyline, but to the subtle change in the room behind her, a movement almost imperceptible at first, like a ripple beneath still water, as a few heads turned toward the entrance, not with excitement, not yet, but with quiet recognition, the kind reserved for someone who did not need an announcement to be noticed. And Emily did not turn. Immediately, she did not follow the curiosity of the crowd, because somewhere deep down she already knew that moment would come, not by coincidence, not by chance, but by a sequence of decisions that had been set in motion long before tonight, and the memory of those afternoons returned, the steady rhythm of the cafe door opening and closing, the soft chime marking each arrival. And among the regular faces there had been one who never quite blended in, a man who carried stillness with him, not the kind that demanded space, but the kind that created it, his presence quiet yet undeniable, always dressed simply, but with a precision that suggested intention rather than effort, and he would take the same seat by the window, order the same black coffee, no sugar, no cream, his voice calm, measured, never rushed, and at first, Emily had treated him like any other customer, offering the same polite nod, the same brief smile, focusing on her work, on the small routines that grounded her. But, over time, something shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that drew attention, but in the small pauses between interactions, in the way he would sometimes look up from his thoughts as she passed, as if noticing not just her presence, but the quiet determination in the way she moved, the way she carried herself even in a life that offered no stage. And there was one morning, early, before the city had fully woken, when the cafe was nearly empty, sunlight just beginning to stretch across the floor in long, pale lines, when he spoke more than usual, asking a question that was simple on the surface, but lingered longer than it should have. "Do you always stay this calm?" he had said, his tone not curious, but observant, as if he had already seen enough to form his own conclusion, and Emily had paused, just briefly, the question catching something unspoken inside her. Before answering with a quiet honesty she did not offer often, "I learned to," and he had nodded, not as someone impressed, but as someone who understood the cost behind that answer, and from that point on, their conversations remained few, measured, never crossing into anything personal, never forcing connection, but there was an awareness between them, subtle and steady, like two people recognizing the same horizon from different places, and he never asked about her past, never offered anything about his own, and that absence of curiosity felt strangely respectful, as if he saw her not as someone to be fixed or saved, but as someone already complete in ways that did not need explanation, and back in the present. As the quiet shift in the ballroom grew more defined, Emily finally turned, not with urgency, not with anticipation, but with a calm that mirrored the countless mornings she had stood behind that cafe counter, and there, near the entrance, he stood again, unchanged in the ways that mattered, his presence cutting through the noise without effort, his gaze finding hers with the same quiet certainty it always had, and though the room had begun to take notice, though whispers started to form without fully understanding why, Emily did not move toward him immediately, because this moment was not about arrival, not about reveal, it was about alignment, the past and the present meeting without conflict, and as the distance between them held for just a second longer, there was an unspoken understanding that whatever came next would not need to be explained, not to the room, not to Daniel, not even to themselves, because some things, once built in silence, did not require words to prove their existence. He did not rush toward her, and that was the first thing that set him apart from everyone else in the room, because while attention slowly gathered around his presence like a quiet tide, he moved with the same unhurried precision Emily remembered from those early mornings, each step measured, each glance intentional, as if he existed outside the urgency that defined everyone else, and the distance between them closed naturally, without spectacle, without need for announcement, until he stood Just within reach, his eyes steady, his expression unchanged, carrying that same calm recognition that had once felt so unfamiliar to her, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because nothing needed to be said in that first exchange. The silence itself holding more weight than any greeting could, and then, with a slight inclination of his head, he offered the same simple acknowledgement he always had, "Emily." Her name spoken without surprise, without emphasis, just certainty, and she answered with a quiet nod, her voice equally composed, "Alexander." And around them, the room continued to shift, the subtle awareness growing into something more defined, as people began to notice not just his presence, but the way others reacted to it. A man near the bar straightened instinctively, a woman who had been mid-conversation paused, her attention drawn without knowing why, and across the room, Daniel's voice faltered for the second time that evening, just enough to reveal the fracture beneath his control, because this was not part of the script he had written, not something he had prepared for, and as his gaze followed the direction of the crowd's attention, it landed on them, standing together with a quiet symmetry that felt deliberate even though nothing about it had been announced, and there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, not fully formed, not yet understood, but enough to unsettle him in a way he could not immediately disguise, and back in that moment between Emily and Alexander, he extended his hand slightly, not as a formal gesture, not as introduction, but as something simpler, something grounded, and she placed her hand in his without hesitation, the contact brief, but steady, a small action that carried more meaning than the room could interpret, and he did not hold it long, did not draw attention to it, only enough to acknowledge connection before letting go, his gaze never leaving hers. "I was wondering if you would come," he said quietly, his tone unchanged, and there was no question in it, only confirmation, and Emily allowed the faintest shift in her expression, not quite a smile, but something close. "I almost did not," she replied, her voice even, and for a second, something like understanding passed between them, unspoken but complete, because both of them knew that this night was never about the past, never about reclaiming anything that had been lost. It was about something else entirely, something that had been building long before this room, long before Daniel's carefully constructed world, and as the music softened slightly, as conversations began to quiet in uneven waves, the presence they created together started to take shape in the space around them, not loud, not forceful, but undeniable in a way that did not need explanation, and from across the room, Daniel watched, the confidence he wore beginning to strain at the edges, because for the first time, he was no longer the center of the moment, no longer the one controlling how the story unfolded, and though he could not yet name what was happening, he could feel it, the shift, the subtle transfer of attention, of gravity, moving away from him and settling somewhere he could not reach, and in that quiet realignment, Emily stood exactly where she was meant to be, not as someone returning to his world, but as someone who had already built her own. The shift in the room became impossible to ignore, not because of anything loud or dramatic, but because attention, once scattered, had begun to gather with quiet intention around a center that was no longer Daniel, and he felt it before he fully understood it. The subtle way conversations near him lost their energy, the way glances drifted past him instead of toward him, and when he finally moved, it was with a purpose that felt slightly sharper than before, his steps cutting across the polished floor as he approached, determination replacing the ease he had worn earlier, because whatever this was, whatever presence had entered his carefully controlled evening, he needed to reclaim it, and as he reached them, his smile returned, practiced, confident, but thinner now, stretched over something less certain. "Alexander," he said, extending his hand quickly, almost too quickly, as if eager to anchor himself in familiarity. "I did not expect you tonight." And there it was. The connection, revealed not through announcement, but through recognition, and a few nearby guests leaned in slightly, sensing the shift without yet understanding its meaning, and Alexander met his hand with the same calm precision, the handshake firm but brief, his expression unchanged. "Daniel," he replied, his tone even, offering no more than acknowledgement, no less than control, and for a moment, The balance between them held, quiet but charged, and Daniel's eyes flickered toward Emily, just for a second, then back again, recalculating, adjusting, trying to place her within this new equation that did not align with the version of the story he had built. "I did not realize you two knew each other," he added, the question hidden beneath a statement, and there was a faint edge beneath his words now, something probing, something careful, and Emily did not rush to answer, did not step forward or back. She simply remained where she was, her presence steady, allowing the silence to stretch just enough to make the moment uncomfortable, and Alexander spoke instead, his voice low but clear. "We have crossed paths," he said, the simplicity of the answer offering no explanation, no detail, only enough to confirm what Daniel could already see, and the ambiguity unsettled him more than any direct answer would have, because it left too much unknown, too much outside his control, and around them, the room had grown quieter, not completely silent, but aware, like a stage waiting for something to unfold, and Daniel let out a small breath, his smile tightening just slightly as he tried to regain the tone of the evening. "Well, it is good to see familiar faces," he said, though the words felt thinner now, less convincing even to himself. And then, as if remembering the role he was meant to play, he placed a light hand on his bride's arm, drawing her closer, reinforcing the image he had created, the life he had chosen. But even that gesture felt different now, less solid, less central, as if it no longer held the weight it once did, and Emily observed it all without reaction, her gaze calm, her posture unchanged, because this moment was not about confrontation, not about proving anything, it was about something quieter, something deeper, the slow unraveling of a narrative that no longer belonged to him, and as Daniel stood there, caught between what he thought he controlled and what was quietly shifting beyond him, he began to realize that whatever had just entered his world was not there to challenge him openly, not there to fight for space. It was simply there, existing with a certainty that did not require permission, and in that quiet certainty, stronger than any argument, the ground beneath him began to feel less stable than it had just moments before. The air shifted again, but this time it was not subtle, not something that could be ignored or quietly dismissed, because from across the room, a man in a tailored suit approached with quiet urgency, his posture straight, his expression composed yet attentive in a way reserved only for someone of significance, and as he reached Alexander, he gave a small, respectful nod before speaking just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Mr. Hayes, the board has been trying to reach you regarding the final approval," and the words landed softly, but their impact moved through the room like a ripple turning into a wave. Conversations stilled, glances sharpened, and Daniel's expression froze for just a fraction longer than it should have, the name settling into place with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. Hayes, not just a passing acquaintance, not just a quiet presence from somewhere undefined, but the same name attached to the investment group Daniel had spent the past year trying to impress, the same name printed at the top of documents he never fully controlled, and in that moment, the invisible structure of power within the room rearranged itself without announcement, without permission, and Alexander did not react with surprise or acknowledgement of status. He simply inclined his head slightly, as if the interruption was expected, as if the importance others placed on it did not alter his composure in the slightest. "It can wait," he said calmly, his voice steady, measured, and the man nodded immediately, stepping back without question, without hesitation, and that single exchange said more than any introduction could have, because it was not about titles or declarations, it was about the way others moved around him, the way decisions seemed to orbit his presence rather than demand his attention, and Daniel saw it, not all at once, but in fragments that quickly aligned into something undeniable, his earlier confidence now thinning into something strained, something uncertain, as he glanced briefly at Emily, then back at Alexander, recalculating again, searching for ground that no longer felt stable beneath him. "I did not realize," he began, but the sentence did not finish, because there was no version of it that would restore the balance he had lost, and Emily remained still, her expression unchanged, her gaze calm, not watching Daniel's reaction, not seeking it, but simply present in a moment that no longer belonged to him, and for the first time, the distance between who she had been in his life and who she stood beside now became visible not just to him, but to everyone within reach of that quiet revelation, and there was no announcement, no dramatic declaration, only the soft weight of understanding settling over the room. And Daniel felt it, the realization forming not through words, but through absence, the absence of control, the absence of narrative, the absence of the version of her he thought he had left behind, because the woman standing here tonight was no longer connected to the life he once dismissed. She was aligned with something else entirely, something he had unknowingly placed himself beneath, and as the silence stretched just long enough to make the truth unavoidable, Emily finally shifted her gaze, not toward Daniel, but toward Alexander, a small movement, almost imperceptible, yet it carried the quiet certainty of everything that had led to this moment, and in that glance, in that stillness, the final layer of the evening revealed itself without a single word spoken, leaving Daniel standing at the center of a room that no longer revolved around him, watching a reality unfold that he had never anticipated and could no longer control. No one spoke for a moment, not because they were told to be silent, but because the truth had already filled the space between them, leaving no room for interruption, and Daniel stood there, the weight of realization settling in slowly, not as a sudden collapse, but as a quiet unraveling of everything he believed he controlled, his gaze shifting once more between Alexander and Emily, searching for something familiar, something he could still define, but finding nothing that belonged to him anymore, and Emily did not meet his eyes this time, not out of avoidance, but because there was nothing left in that direction that required her attention, her focus already moving forward, already aligned with something beyond this room, beyond this moment. And Alexander, standing beside her, did not assert dominance, did not claim victory. He simply existed within his place, his presence steady, unaffected by the tension that still lingered around them, and that was what made it undeniable, because power that needed to be announced could be challenged, but power that moved quietly, that reshaped the room without effort, left no space for resistance, and somewhere in the background, the music resumed its rhythm, soft and measured, as if the evening itself had decided to continue, but nothing within it remained the same, and Daniel felt it, the shift he could not reverse, the narrative he could not reclaim, because for the first time, he was no longer the one defining how the story would be remembered, and as Emily took a small step forward, it was not toward him, not toward confrontation, but toward the exit, toward the open space beyond the polished doors, her movement calm, deliberate, and Alexander followed without hesitation, not leading, not guiding, simply walking beside her, their pace aligned without discussion, and as they passed, a few guests instinctively stepped aside, not out of obligation, but out of recognition, the kind that did not require explanation, and the doors opened quietly, the cool night air slipping in just enough to contrast the warmth of the ballroom behind them, and for a brief second, Emily paused at the threshold, not to look back, not to reconsider, but to allow the moment to settle completely, the past, the present, the distance she had traveled all converging into a single, quiet certainty, and then she stepped forward, crossing into a space that belonged entirely to her, leaving behind the room, the voices, the version of herself that no longer existed, and Daniel remained where he was, surrounded by everything he had built, yet somehow further from control than he had ever been, watching the doors close with a softness that felt louder than anything said that night, and in that final silence, heavier than any confrontation, the truth revealed itself in its simplest form, not through words, not through revenge, but through presence, through absence, through the undeniable fact that she had not returned to reclaim anything from him, because she had already built something greater without him, and as the lights continued to glow and the evening carried on, the only thing that lingered in the space she left behind was the quiet understanding that she did not win him back, she won herself.